snow tore through the night like shards of glass, and Eleanor Kane, a frail widow of 73, never expected her quiet farmhouse to echo with the roar of 20 desperate bikers, begging for shelter. By dawn, she would discover that kindness can summon both danger and devotion, because waiting outside her front gate were 1,000 Hell's Angels, engines rumbling like a storm, and no one could tell if they had come as saviors or executioners. The storm had started just after dusk, the kind of storm that chewed through the countryside without mercy, burying fences, splitting trees, and making the world disappear in white silence. Eleanor Kane had seen many winters in her 73 years, but this one felt heavier, meaner. The wind howled across the frozen fields like an animal in pain, rattling the old window panes of her farmhouse until it seemed the whole place might shiver apart. She sat at the kitchen table with her knitting in her lap, a small fire crackling. In the stove, its light glowing against the walls that were lined with pictures of a life gone by. Her husband John's face stared back at her from a photograph above the mantel, square-jawed, laughing, caught in the middle of tossing a hay bale. It had been 2 winters since he died, and still the silence in the house pressed down on her, shoulders like an extra blanket she could never shrug off. The kettle whistled faintly on the stove. Eleanor rose, joints stiff, and poured herself a cup of tea. Outside, the storm grew tease, the wind screaming so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. She moved slowly to the window and peered through the frost. Nothing but the swirling, white chaos. Her husband used to love nights like this. Storms remind you how small you are, Ellie, he'd say, wrapping his arms around her as the windows rattled. And how strong you have to be. She sipped her tea, whispering into the empty air, "Well, John, it's just me now, strong as I can be." That was when she heard it, a sound so out of place in the howling night that at first she thought it was her imagination, a deep, heavy pounding on the door. Her cup nearly slipped from her hands. She froze, the noise echoing again, 3 hard knocks, deliberate and desperate, then another. For a moment, her heart raced so wildly she thought it might burst. No one came out this far in a storm. No one had reason to. She moved to the door cautiously, pressing her ear to the wood, over the wind. She could just make out muffled voices, men's voices, ragged with cold. "Help, please. Anyone in there?" Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to back away. John had always warned her about men on bikes, and though she didn't hear engines, she knew that tone: rough, low, dangerous. The pounding came again, harder this time. She glanced back at the telephone mounted on the wall. The line had been dead since the first gust of the storm, even if it weren't. The sheriff was 30 miles away. Slowly, she lifted the latch and cracked the door. The wind blasted in, cutting through her like a knife. And standing there on her porch were figures she could hardly believe. A cluster of men, their leather jackets stiff with ice, their faces pale and raw from the cold. Their beards glistened with frost, and their boots were caked with snow so thick it looked like they had walked straight out of the blizzard's mouth. The one in front stepped forward. He was broad-shouldered, his face marked with tattoos that crept up his neck like ivy. His lips were cracked, his voice gravelly. "Ma'am, we just need somewhere to get warm. We'll freeze out here." Eleanor's throat tightened. There were so many of them, at least 20, huddled together like wolves in the snow. She could smell the gasoline and smoke clinging to their clothes, even from the doorway. Her mind raced. She was an old woman, alone. What if they turned violent? What if they stole everything she had left? But then she caught sight of the youngest of them, barely more than a boy, maybe 19. His skin was bluish with cold, his lips trembling so hard he couldn't speak. Another man's hand shook as he tried to light a cigarette, but failed, his fingers too stiff. They weren't wolves. Not right now. They were freezing men. Dying men. Eleanor felt John's eyes on her from that photograph above the mantel. He'd told her to be careful, yes, but he'd also taught her never to let anyone die on her doorstep. With a sharp inhale, she pulled the door open wider. "Get in here," she barked, her voice firmer than she felt. "Quickly now, before you bring the snow in with you." The men moved fast, stumbling into the warmth of her kitchen, stamping the snow off their boots. The smell of leather, sweat, and motor oil filled the small farmhouse, overwhelming the scent of tea and wood smoke. Eleanor shut the door behind them, locking the storm out. For a moment, silence. 20 pairs of eyes swept over her modest home, the worn quilt on the sofa, the faded curtains, the stack of firewood beside the stove. She clutched her teacup like a weapon, daring any of them to try something. Then the tattooed leader turned to her, giving a short nod. "Thank you," Eleanor sniffed, unwilling to let her fear show. "Sit. Warm yourselves. But don't touch anything that isn't yours." The men obeyed, spreading out across the room, holding their hands to the fire, rubbing life back into their frozen skin. One groaned with relief, another sighed so deeply it was almost a sob. Eleanor busied herself with the stove. Her pantry was low cans of beans, flour, a few potatoes, but she set water to boil, pulled down the last of her soup stock, and threw in everything she could spare. As she worked, she felt their eyes on her, some cautious, some curious. "Lady," one muttered, "you're a saint." She ignored him, stirring the pot with sharp, efficient movements. "Saint? No. Fool? Maybe." When she finally ladled steaming soup into chip bowls, the men devoured it like wolves indeed, but wolves who hadn't eaten in weeks. They murmured thanks between mouthfuls, steam curling around their weathered faces. As she stood watching, Eleanor's fear began to ease. They were rough, yes, tattoos, scars, hardened eyes, but under it all, they were human, hungry, cold, grateful. The youngest one, the boy with trembling lips, looked up at her shyly. "Ma'am, you saved us." Her chest ached. She saw her grandson in that boy's face. She thought of how John would have reached out, how he'd never let the storm take a man without a fight. "You'll get through the night," she said simply. For a brief moment, there was peace. The storm howled outside, but inside, the fire burned steady, and 20 strangers sat in warmth instead of death. Then the leader set his empty bowl down and leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on Eleanor. "You don't know what you've just done, lady," he said, his voice low, almost regretful, the room still. The fire crackled. Eleanor's hand tightened on the ladle. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cold. The man's tattooed fingers drummed against the table. He didn't answer right away, but the way the others looked at him then at her told her this was no simple matter of shelter from the storm. And for the first time that night, Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. The storm had not eased by morning. If anything, it had grown crueler. The farmhouse groaned beneath the weight of the wind, its shutters clattering like loose teeth, while snow piled high against the windowsills, blurring the edges of dawn. Inside, the warmth of the stove pushed back the cold, but it couldn't chase away the unease that settled in Eleanor's chest. She moved quietly through her kitchen, filling the kettle, her every motion deliberate. 20 strangers still lingered under her roof, their presence impossible to ignore. The smell of leather, cigarettes, and damp boots clung to every corner, so foreign against the familiar scent of pine wood and soap that had defined her home for years. They were sprawled wherever they could find space, on the couch, against the walls, even on the braided rug by the hearth. Their heavy jackets hung from hooks by the door, dripping meltwater onto the floorboards. For a moment, Eleanor studied them, her sharp eyes picking over the tattoos etched into their skin, the jagged scars along their knuckles, the hardness carved into their faces. Wolves, she thought, wolves dressed as men, and yet she also saw their exhaustion. Their hands, once clenched, now relaxed. One of them snored softly, his face slack like that of a child. Still, she didn't trust them, not yet. The leader, the tattooed man who warned her she had no idea what she'd done, was awake. He sat at the table, broad shoulders hunched, rolling a cigarette with slow precision. He watched her with dark, unreadable eyes. "You got a name, lady?" he asked, voice rough as gravel. Eleanor tightened the knot of her shawl. "Eleanor Kane." He lit a cigarette, exhaled, and nodded once. "I'm Riker." The name didn't comfort her. It sounded like trouble. For a moment, there was only the hiss of the stove and the steady pop of the fire. Then Eleanor said, almost sharply, "You mentioned last night that I don't know what I've done. Perhaps you'd like to explain yourself." Riker studied the cigarette glowing between his fingers. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low, deliberate. "We're part of a club. Used to ride under the Hells Angels patch. Not anymore." The way the words fell made her shiver. "You left them." A humorless smile tugged at his mouth. "Some might say we broke away. Others would say we ran. Either way, it wasn't clean." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She knew enough every newspaper headline, every whispered warning from her husband when he was alive. The Hells Angels weren't the sort of men you just left. "And by taking us in," Riker continued, finally lifting his eyes to hers, "you've tied yourself to our story, like it or not." Eleanor's grip tightened around the kettle handle. The steel of it bit into her palm. I gave you a roof for one night. That's all. Nothing more. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. In their eyes, it won't look that way. A cold pulse of fear rippled through her. She steadied herself, straightened her spine, and poured the hot water into a chipped teapot. She wasn't going to let him see her shake. You'll take your warmth, your food, and then you'll be gone, she said firmly, but in the silence that followed, Eleanor couldn't help noticing how the men shifted not like conquerors staking claim, but like exiles carrying shame. One reached for her broken rocking chair by the hearth, running a hand over the split leg. With a pocket knife and a strip of leather, he began binding it carefully, methodically, as though fixing it for his own grandmother. Another, older than the rest, spotted the guitar leaning dusty in the corner. He lifted it with surprising gentleness, wiped the strings with his sleeve, and strummed. The sound was rough at first, but then a melody took shape, not rowdy, not crude soft, a hymn. The same hymn Eleanor's husband had loved to hum while mending fences. The tune hit her like a blow. She gripped the edge of the counter, the room spinning with memory, and yet, as the notes filled the farmhouse, something shifted. The bikers grew quiet, their conversations dying out, their eyes far away. For a moment, they weren't outlaws. They were sons who once sat in churches, boys who once sang in school halls, men who lost something they couldn't quite name. Eleanor felt her chest ache. Against her will, she softened. You remind them of someone, Riker said suddenly, breaking her reverie. She looked at him, who? He gestured toward the men. Mothers, grandmothers, homes they left behind. You give them something they forgot they missed. Eleanor wanted to dismiss it, to hold tight to her fear, but the truth of it pressed down on her, undeniable. She saw it in their eyes, hunger not just for food, but for warmth, for comfort, for memory. Later, as the hours dragged on and the storm refused to relent, conversations bloomed in small pockets. One man, his beard shot with gray, told Eleanor he hadn't spoken to his mother in 20 years, and now she was gone. Another admitted he kept a locket in his jacket, a picture of a daughter he'd never met. They didn't speak of crimes, of loyalty, of the violence that had driven them here. They spoke of loss. Eleanor found herself listening, sometimes answering with only a nod, sometimes with a dry quip that made them laugh. The walls between them thinned, if only for a night. But the unease never vanished. It sat in her stomach like a stone, for every tender note of the guitar, for every laugh that felt almost genuine. There was the knowledge of what they were, men hunted by a brotherhood far bigger, far meaner than 20 lost souls. By the time the fire burned low and the last of the soup was scraped from the pot, Eleanor felt a strange bond forming between them, fragile, unspoken, but real. It was dawn when the first tremor came. She felt it before she heard it, a faint vibration through the floorboards, rattling the cups on the table. At first she thought it was the storm again, some distant thunder rolling across the plains. But then came another, stronger. The vibration built, steady, relentless, like the approach of 1,000 drums. The bikers froze, every head lifted. Then came the sound, low at first, then swelling until it swallowed the room, the unmistakable growl of engines. Dozens, hundreds, maybe more. Eleanor's blood went cold. She moved to the frosted window, wiped it with her sleeve, and peered out into the pale light of morning. The storm had thinned just enough to reveal the horizon, and across it rolled a sight that stole her breath. Motorcycles, endless motorcycles, a river of chrome and leather pouring across the snow-covered road, stretching farther than she could see. The ground trembled beneath her feet. Behind her, one of the bikers whispered, his voice cracking with dread, "They found us." The farmhouse shuddered as if the earth itself was groaning beneath it. Cups rattled on the shelves, the fire hissed in the stove, and Eleanor Kane's heart pounded in rhythm with the sound outside, an endless, rolling thunder of engines. The 20 bikers inside had gone still, their faces drained of what little color the storm hadn't already stolen. Some staggered to the windows, others pressed their backs to the wall as though bracing for a siege. "They've come for us," one muttered, voice hoarse with terror. "Christ, they found us." Another grabbed his jacket, fumbling with the zipper as if ready to make a run for it. "We shouldn't have stopped here. They'll burn this place down with us in it." Her double quotes. Her Eleanor stood in the middle of her kitchen, shawl drawn tight, hands trembling only slightly around the edge of her apron. The words cut sharper than the cold ever could. She had known somewhere in the pit of her chest that taking these men it would draw danger to her door, but knowing it and hearing it were different things. She moved to the window, brushing the frost away with her sleeve. Her breath caught. The horizon had become a living wall of leather and chrome, 1,000 strong, maybe more, pouring across the snow-blanketed plain like an army of phantoms. The storm swirled around them, snow whipping through the air, but the riders kept their formation, rows upon rows, engines snarling in a furious, synchronized growl that drowned out even the wind. Their vests gleamed with patches the death's head insignia of the Hells Angels, unmistakable. Dreaded. Eleanor felt the farmhouse floor vibrate beneath her slippers. Her entire world seemed to pulse with the weight of that roar. Behind her, the men were unraveling. They'll cut us down where we stand. They'll torch the place. Lady, you don't understand. They'll never let us walk. Their panic collided with her silence. The room thick with fear. For the first time since John's death, Eleanor felt something stir in her chest, not dread, not despair, but still. Her husband had gone quietly to winters ago. A slow death that hollowed her days. She had endured grief so sharp it had left her raw, stripped to the bone. What more could these men on motorcycles take from her? What more could the world steal? She turned from the window and fixed her gaze on Riker, their leader. His jaw was clenched. His cigarette burned low between his fingers, but even his hand shook. "You brought this to my door," Eleanor said, her voice steady, each word cutting clean through the noise. "So hear me now. I won't hand you over." The room snapped to silence. 20 men, hardened by years of violence, stared at her as if she were mad. Riker blinked. "Ma'am, you don't know what you're saying. If you stand with us, you stand against them, and no one survives that. I've already lost what mattered most," Eleanor said, her eyes flicking to John's photograph above the mantel. "You think I'm afraid of losing my roof, my walls, my life? No. What I won't do is let 20 men freeze to death one night and burn alive the next because I lack the courage to say no." Her voice rose, stronger than the storm outside. "If they mean to bring their fire, they'll bring it over my body first." A stunned silence followed. Some of the bikers lowered their eyes, shame written across their faces. Others stared at her with something like awe. Riker ground his cigarette out in the ashtray, stood, and ran a hand over his jaw. "Lady, you might just be crazier than the rest of us, or braver," the youngest whispered. Eleanor ignored them all and moved to the door. Her hand shook as she pulled her shawl tighter, then steadied as she grasped the handle. Slowly, deliberately, she opened it. The storm blasted in, snow and wind tearing at her hair. But the sound that dominated was the engines, the unholy choir of 1,000 machines, close enough now that she could see their breath steaming in the frozen air, the patches on their backs glowing red and black against the white world. She stepped onto her porch. The sight swallowed her whole. They stretched across the horizon, a sea of leather and chrome, helmets gleaming, handlebars shining. Engines rumbled so loud her chest vibrated with every thrum. Snow whipped around them, clinging to their vests, their beards, their goggles. But they sat unmoving, a wall of defiance and fury. For a moment, Eleanor was struck by their sheer magnitude. It was not an army in the poetic sense. It was an army, in truth, a force so great that her little farmhouse was a candle flame flickering in the path of a hurricane. The front row shifted. A rider swung a boot to the ground, dismounted, and began walking toward her. Eleanor squinted through the snow. He was taller than Riker, his shoulders broad beneath the thick leather vest. He moved with the ease of a man who commanded respect. Without speaking, the other riders parted slightly as he passed. His helmet gleamed black, visor down, reflecting the pale dawn. The engines behind him lowered to a growl as he approached the porch. Each step sank deep into the snow, slow and deliberate, until he stood at the foot of her steps. The storm whipping between them, Eleanor's heart hammered, but she did not move. She held her ground, chin high, the storm tugging at her shawl. The man reached up, gripped the sides of his helmet, and lifted it free. Snowflakes clung to his hair, his face weathered and lined, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He looked at her not like a stranger, but like someone who had been expecting her, and then, in a voice that cut through the roar of engines and the howl of the storm, he spoke. Eleanor Kane. Her breath caught. He knew her name. The snow swirled in ghostly spirals between them, but Eleanor barely felt the cold anymore. She stood rooted on her porch, staring at the man who had called her name as though he'd known it all his life. Eleanor Kane. he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The weight of memory died behind him. 1,000 engines growled like an animal chained and waiting for its master's command. The 20 men inside her farmhouse watched from the windows, their fear pressed against the glass. Eleanor's jaw set. "You know me," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. The man's mouth curved, not quite a smile, not quite a sneer. "Not you, him." He tilted his chin toward the house, toward the photograph above the mantel inside. John Kane. The world tilted. For a moment, Eleanor thought she had misheard. But no, he had said it clear. "John, my husband." The man climbed the steps closer, snow crunching under his boots. "Your husband. Back before you knew him. Back before he chose a quiet life. He rode with us. Rode with me." Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. Her John. The man who fixed fences, who read the newspaper aloud, who kissed her cheek in the morning as though it were sacred ritual. A Hell's Angel. It didn't seem possible, and yet pieces clicked. The way he never spoke of his youth, the scars he carried without explanation, the way he warned her about men on bikes, but with a tone that was never quite to stay more like regret. She swallowed hard. "You're lying." The man's eyes burned with memory. "No, I was there when he patched in. I was there when he rode like the devil was chasing him. And I was there when he told us he was leaving, said he'd found something better, said he'd found you." The porch seemed to spin. The storm wailed through the fields, but Eleanor barely heard it. She saw John's face in her mind, his easy laugh, his steady hands, and for the first time, she glimpsed the shadow behind his eyes, the past he never gave words to. Her voice came out rough. "Why didn't he tell me?" The leader's gaze softened, just barely. "Because he wanted you to know him as he was with you, not who he had been before. He left that life for love. Few men do. Fewer still succeed." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She straightened her spine, squaring herself against the storm, against the man, against the thousand waiting beyond. "Then you should know what kind of woman he married," she said. Her voice was iron. "Because I won't let you burn this house. Not while I stand." The man studied her, snow clinging to his hair. "You gave shelter to traitors," he said, his voice low, rumbling like the engines behind him. "Men who turned their backs on us. There's a price for that." Behind her, the 20 bikers shifted uneasily, whispers of panic leaking through the walls. Eleanor lifted her chin. "If you want blood, you'll have to spill it with me standing in the doorway." The silence that followed was absolute. The storm itself seemed to hush. The leader's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. He was taller, stronger, a man built for intimidation, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She had buried her husband, survived winters alone, faced nights darker than this one. What was one more storm? "You'd stand against 1,000 men," he asked quietly. "I'd stand against 10,000. She shot back. "Because they were dying when they came to me. And no woman with a soul lets a man freeze on her porch. If that makes me your enemy, so be it." The engines rumbled louder, as if stirred by her defiance. The 20 inside the house waited for the roof to collapse in fire and fury. But then something unexpected happened. The leader laughed, not cruelly, not mockingly, deep, raw, surprised. He shook his head, snow scattering from his hair. "John always said you had steel in you." Looked like he wasn't lying. He turned, sweeping his gaze across the 1,000 riders who waited behind him, then back to Eleanor. "We won't touch your home," he said finally, out of respect for him and for you. Relief washed through Eleanor, but only for a breath, because his eyes hardened again. But the 20 inside, they must answer for what they've done. "That I cannot forgive." The men inside erupted, pleading, cursing, shouting, the farmhouse filled with their fear, their voices muffled but frantic. Eleanor felt it crash against her heart, and for a moment she thought of closing the door, letting fate have its way. But then she remembered the boy's trembling lips as he thanked her for saving him, the man who had repaired her chair, him that had carried her back to her husband for a fleeting moment. She could not abandon them. "They've already paid," she said sharply. "With their shame, with their fear. Isn't that enough?" The leader's expression was stone. "No." "Then take me to," Eleanor snapped, "because their blood will not be spilled alone. If you want them, you'll have to step over me first." The storm gusted, flinging snow between them. The leader stared at her for a long, unblinking moment. Then, slowly, He looked past her to the window, where 20 faces stared back in horror and awe. He exhaled, long and heavy, as though releasing years of rage. "Damn it, woman," he muttered. He turned and lifted his arm. 1,000 engines roared to life, deafening, thunder rolling across the plains. But instead of advancing, they began to peel away, one by one, row by row, until the army of leather and chrome flowed back into the horizon. Swallowed by the snow, the 20 inside erupted again, but this time in disbelief, in laughter, in tears of relief. The leader turned back to Eleanor one last time. His eyes softened, not with kindness exactly, but with something close to respect. "They walk, but hear me, if they ever raise arms against us again, there will be no mercy, not even for you." Eleanor nodded once, unyielding. "Then make sure they remember that." He studied her a moment longer, then pulled his helmet back on. Without another word, he strode through the snow, mounted his bike, and with a single twist of the throttle, disappeared with the last of the angels into the clearing storm. Silence fell. Real silence. Not the growl of engines, not the howl of the wind, just the soft whisper of snow falling onto fields. That seemed suddenly endless. Eleanor stood alone on the porch, shawl whipping around her shoulders, her breath clouding in the dawn air. Her knees trembled, but she did not sit. She stared at the horizon until the last trace of them was gone. Then she whispered, to the cold air, to the memory of her husband, "You never told me, John, but maybe I always knew." She turned, stepped back inside, and closed the door. The house was quiet, the storm passing. For the first time in years, Eleanor did not feel the silence pressing in. It felt instead like something she had earned, something she could live with. And that's a wrap. If you like the story, show your support by hitting that subscribe button.